Canadian steel and lumber industries will always be at the heart of Canada's competitiveness. Our core of the strategy in Budget 2025 is to unleash $1 trillion in total investments in Canada over the course of the next 5 years. That alone will increase our GDP by over 3.5%, or $3,500 for every Canadian worker, more than twice what's being taken from us. We must protect our workers and our industries who are most exposed to U.S. tariffs. That means in steel, aluminum, auto, and lumber sectors. Help them bridge to the future.
Canada is quietly changing the game, and the United States is already feeling the pressure. While Canada grows stronger by keeping control of its valuable lumber, American builders are running out of easy options. The most shocking part is that nothing looks illegal, leaving Washington with almost no way to stop a strategy that is already causing serious problems. American construction firms have just issued a rare coordinated warning. The housing market is entering a period of severe instability, and the cause is not a financial crisis, not a regulatory overreach, and not a sudden collapse in demand. It is tightening Canadian softwood lumber supply. Builders across the country are scrambling. And what makes this situation almost impossible to counter from Washington's position is that Canada has not announced a single formal restriction that American trade lawyers can challenge. The strategy Canada is executing is something far more durable than a ban, and it is already working. Here is what changed, and why the old tools Washington has used to manage this relationship for 40 years do not apply to what Canada is doing now. Canada has restructured how it prices, processes, and distributes its softwood lumber in ways that bypass tariff frameworks entirely while delivering the same commercial outcome. Maximum pressure on American construction supply, with no visible legal target to attack. No export restriction has been filed. No formal policy has been announced. The pressure is structural, and structural pressure cannot be litigated away. The numbers behind that pressure are specific and documented. Roughly 30 to 35% of all softwood lumber used in American home building comes from Canada. In a typical wood frame house, lumber accounts for 20 to 25% of total material costs. A 10% increase in lumber prices adds between $8,000 and $15,000 to the cost of a new home. For American families navigating high interest rates and persistent inflation simultaneously, that is not a marginal input cost variation. It is a structural shock that removes home ownership from the realistic financial reach of millions of households and feeds inflationary pressure across the broader consumer economy. Canada's new lumber strategy operates through 5 simultaneous structural pressure points, none of which constitutes a formal trade barrier in the conventional legal sense, and all of which together create a supply choke that compounds rather than resolves under the trade policy responses Washington has historically reached for. The first pressure point is production control. Canada has been closing and consolidating older, less efficient sawmills since 2018. National softwood output has fallen by roughly 15 to 20% from that peak year. In British Columbia alone, more than 10,000 forestry jobs disappeared between 2019 and 2025, not as a result of a policy decision to reduce employment, but as a consequence of consolidation that permanently reduced the volume of cheap, high-frequency lumber exports that once flooded southward into American framing markets. Fewer mills produce less output. Less output means tighter supply. Tighter supply means higher prices. And in a tighter market, Canada captures the premium rather than American buyers collecting the discount they had historically expected as a structural feature of the bilateral relationship. The second pressure point is domestic priority. Canadian provinces have redirected available lumber supply toward domestic housing projects, infrastructure development, and public construction initiatives. Exporting to the United States is no longer the automatic default when Canadian supply tightens. American buyers now move to the back of the allocation queue, not because of a tariff or regulation, but because Canadian governments made a deliberate policy choice that their own citizens, builders, and economic development deserve priority access to Canadian resources. That choice did not require legislation. It required a decision, and that decision permanently altered supply chain assumptions that the American construction industry had never questioned during decades of frictionless integration. The third pressure point is value-added processing. Canada is exporting less raw lumber and more engineered wood products, cross-laminated timber, glued laminated beams, advanced structural panels. The economic consequence is higher revenue per tree harvested with lower physical volume crossing the border. Canada captures more value per cubic meter by processing domestically rather than shipping raw logs south, keeping the jobs, wages, and industrial value inside the country. American builders receive fewer affordable boards at any price point. Canada earns more from fewer exports. The arithmetic of the old relationship has reversed. American buyers are paying more for less, and Canada is earning more from less volume. The fourth pressure point is environmental standards. New carbon tracking requirements and sustainability certification frameworks have raised compliance costs across the Canadian industry. American buyers can still technically purchase Canadian lumber, but the product is more expensive and less abundant than it was under the previous arrangement. Environmental policy converts into an indirect trade lever, one that operates outside traditional tariff frameworks entirely, while achieving the same functional outcome of reducing American access to cheap softwood inputs. Washington cannot challenge a sustainability certification requirement through the WTO the way it can challenge an export tax. The mechanism is legal, documentable, and politically defensible. The fifth pressure point is logistics prioritization. Canadian railways and ports now schedule energy shipments, mineral exports, and critical materials ahead of lumber in their capacity allocation. Softwood lumber shipments face deliberate sequencing delays, heightened transport cost uncertainty, and rising logistics expenses, an invisible squeeze that compounds every other pressure point without requiring any formal announcement. No single element of this five-part structure constitutes a trade barrier. Together, they form a choke point that tightens supply, raises prices, and creates planning uncertainty across American construction without producing a single actionable legal target. Once lumber supply tightens and prices escalate, the downstream impact on American construction moves through four distinct damage cycles that compound on each other rather than resolving. The first cycle is direct cost inflation. Builders do not absorb material price increases. They layer risk premiums on top of increases to protect against further volatility. As lumber costs climb, new home prices rise faster than wages, pushing homeownership out of reach for the buyers who are already most financially stretched. That dynamic feeds inflation through the consumer economy, keeps interest rates elevated for longer, and adds financing cost pressure to every new construction project simultaneously. The second cycle is timeline disruption. Less predictable lumber supply creates construction scheduling crises where projects face constant delays from material availability uncertainty. A single month of delay can raise total project costs by 5 to 7% through financing charges, labor retention, and equipment rental. Projects that were marginally viable at original cost estimates become financially impossible after delay-driven escalation. The disruption multiplies losses rather than creating conditions for recovery. The third cycle is market expectations damage. Fear of further tightening begins driving destructive behavior before the physical shortage fully materializes. Developers, distributors, and wholesalers rush to secure supply ahead of anticipated shortages, creating hoarding, speculative buying, and artificial scarcity layered on top of genuine supply constraints. Prices rise not only because lumber is objectively tighter, but because every market participant expects it to be tighter, a self-reinforcing feedback loop that destabilizes pricing across the entire construction economy independently of actual physical supply conditions at any given moment. The fourth cycle is the political and electoral damage that Washington fears most. Housing is no longer purely an economic issue in America. It determines elections. Rising prices push younger families permanently out of ownership, raise rents across cities, and increase housing's weight inside consumer inflation calculations. As inflation stays elevated from housing cost pressure, interest rates remain higher for longer, creating a cost spiral that traces directly to trade policy failures and resource dependency assumptions that decades of bilateral integration had made invisible.